Well, how we doing, church? All right. If I haven't met you yet, my name is Jake, and I mostly teach at our downtown church, but every now and again, Pastor Ant asks if I want to teach here, and every time he asks, I say, yes, of course. I don't think I've said no yet, but I love teaching here, and I always, whenever I come up here, I always just feel so blessed and encouraged by the band. I don't know if y'all agree with that, but man, I just feel so encouraged right now. And I will say too, I really love you guys and teaching here. I feel like y'all have taught me how to worship to where, I'm like bobbing whenever, to where I'm at our downtown church and I'm in the front row getting ready to teach and everyone's just like standing really still while they're singing. And I'm the only one just like doing this and like clapping along. That's because of you guys. So thank you for that. Look at God. So today marks the first day of the Advent season, which if you're unfamiliar, it comes from this Latin word adventus, which is a Latin word used for when a king arrives to a town to usher in good news, to usher in a word of peace and proclamation to a town. And the early church adopted this phrase adventus and applied it to the coming of King Jesus when he was born to this earth 2,000 years ago. And we take 4 Sundays to prepare our hearts for Christmas Day, knowing that Jesus arrived on earth 2,000 years ago to say a word of peace and a word of good news to us. And in the meantime, we know that Jesus is coming back. So as we celebrate his first advent, we prepare our hearts not only for Christmas, but as we look forward to his second advent, when he's going to do away with sin and death forever. So a quick plug, just real quick, shameless plug for the Advent Guide. One way we do that, we wrote an Advent Guide for y'all. It's in the lobby. We want you to have that. We have daily readings for you and your family, whether you're new to reading the Bible or new to leading your family in daily family worship. That's a great little guide for you to sort of prepare your heart for that. But this is also a time where, culturally speaking, we as around the planet, but especially in America, for these next 4 weeks, whether you're a Christian or not, people celebrate the Christmas season in a number of ways. People will start building up their wish list of what they want to get. They'll fill up their calendars with all sorts of Christmas parties. They will watch Christmas movies to get prepared for it. I know for our family, we're one of those folks who the day after Halloween is when we start bringing out all the Christmas stuff and we start hanging up the tree. I know I'm one of the rare few, but we love Christmas that much. And one of our Blair family traditions is Thanksgiving night. We watch Home Alone with our kids. We've been doing that now for about 10 years or so. That's just a tradition. That's what we do to get into the holiday season. But one thing people do, again, Christian or not, to prepare for Christmas Day is singing Christmas carols. Whether you know it or not, it is just a lot of Christmas songs are jam-packed with such good biblical truth. And so for this season, what we thought we'd do is we would take each week, each Sunday, and look at a particular Christmas carol you might be familiar with, but just unpack a little bit of it to see just how rich it is in biblical truth. So with that, this first week, we're going to be looking at the song, O Come, Emmanuel. So can I drop some lines on you real quick? All right. It says this, O come, Emmanuel, and ransom captive Israel that mourns in lonely exile here until the Son of God appears. Rejoice, rejoice, Emmanuel shall come to thee, O Israel. This is one of my favorite songs, in part because I think it captures the Advent season really well, this idea of waiting and longing and hoping. And so these are the ideas we're going to unpack this morning. We're going to look at a few verses in John chapter 1. So if you have a Bible, turn there. But prior to the coming of Jesus, this is precisely what God's people were doing. They were waiting. They were waiting on the promised one to come. And the opening lines of John's gospel puts us right into the middle of that story. So I want to spend a few minutes just looking at sort of the context of John chapter 1. Verse 9, it says this of John chapter 1. It says, the true light, which gives light to everyone, was coming into the world. So the Gospel of John opens the scene on Jesus' arrival in a pretty unique way. In fact, John's gospel account is pretty unique compared to the other gospel accounts. You have Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And I've heard it said that those guys are almost like historians, almost like they're putting together a documentary movie of the life of Jesus. But when you get to John, he sort of like throws you a curveball, and he's going to talk about historical facts of Jesus, but he's using it in a very poetic, sort of artistic way, capturing themes and ideas about Jesus that the other gospel accounts don't. So John will talk a lot about light versus darkness and life versus death to sort of get us into really understanding more fully what Jesus has come to do. And so with that, he says in verse 9, the true light which gives light to everyone has come into the world. And this is actually a callback to a verse in Isaiah chapter 9 that says this, that the people who walked in darkness have seen a great light, that those who dwelt in a land of deep darkness, on them a light has shone. This prophecy was written some 700 years before Jesus was born, and John not only will cite verses in the Old Testament, but he will use a lot of Old Testament ideas and sort of poetically weave them throughout his gospel account. And he's talking about in Isaiah chapter 9, this idea that one day a promised one is going to come up to bring light into the darkness. This was a prophecy regarding the coming Messiah, or in the New Testament known as the Christ, this anointed one, this king who is going to come up, and he's going to shine a light in the darkness by coming to be with Israel once and for all, for his rule and reign, for his kingdom to be here for good. So just a couple weeks ago, most of y'all remember, we were in the 10 Commandments and how God rescued his people in the Exodus from the captivity of Egypt. But as God's people strayed away from his rule and love, they were sent back into captivity again for their sin. But the good news within the Old Testament is God loves them too much to just leave them in their captivity. And so he gives them promise upon promise upon promise that one day a greater exodus is going to happen, and a greater Moses will lead God's people out of their captivity. And one day this greater Moses would be a king who would establish his kingdom forever. But in the meantime, they had to wait. They had to wait. They read their scriptures, and as they looked forward to the day when the king would arrive, they would celebrate Passover every single year. They would celebrate Sabbath every single week as they waited for the day when this greater Moses would lead them to the promised land once and for all. And the truth was, for them, waiting wasn't easy. Waiting wasn't easy. The same is true for us. If you ever had something you were looking forward to, you know how hard it can be at times to just wait and wait and wait. I'll give you a really silly example. For me and my family, we love watching movies. That is one of the primary ways that we Sabbath as a family. I love going to the movie theaters with friends, and I just love it so much. And one of my favorite movie franchises is the Fast and Furious franchise. Love it so much. And I remember Fast 8 came out like 4 years ago, and we were just so pumped up, me and all my friends, and we knew Fast 9 was coming out in about 2.5 years. It was set to be like summer 2020. So I remember 2018, it's like, okay, summer 2020, we're going to go see this. We put it on our digital calendar. We started like hyping it up. And then 2020 came around, and we were like, this is it. This is finally going to be our year. We get to celebrate this and watch this together. But then something happened in 2020. I don't know if you were aware of that. They had to cancel that movie. They pushed it back another 1.5 years or so. And so what became just 2.5 years ended up becoming 4 years. But we ended up watching it, and it was awesome. One of the greatest movie experiences ever. But the point is, waiting wasn't easy for us. On a more serious note, though, I'm a dad with 3 kids, and you might have felt this if you're a parent, especially, when it's your first child, just the waiting, just the anticipation. You know the child is coming. You have no idea what to expect. You don't know how tired you'll be. You don't know like just how exhausted you're going to be, but you're just waiting and the anticipation grows. And the more you wait, the more this anticipation builds. And the more the anticipation builds, the more joy is in store. And I remember, man, I am not a crier, but I remember 7 years ago when our first child was born, like just tears instantly just welling up, just ugly crying all over the place because, man, all that anticipation and joy had built into this moment. But man, the waiting wasn't easy. And this is what's going on for the Israelites prior to Jesus being born. For the Israelites, God would regularly raise up prophets who would speak on behalf of God to the people, telling the people to remember God, to hope in the coming Messiah. But when we get to the New Testament, God hadn't spoken to his people for some 400 years. And there was silence from God. And I don't know about you, but man, if I don't talk to someone for like 4 years, man, I can barely remember the person's face. But man, think about this, how the Israelites must have felt. It had been 400 years since God had spoken. Can you imagine what they were feeling during all that time? Among our staff at our church at Midtown, we have this leadership saying that goes something like this, that where there's a void in communication, negativity will fill that void. I'll say that again. Where there is a void in communication, negativity will fill the void. Meaning, if you haven't heard from me or I haven't heard from you, what tends to happen on a psychological level is I will begin to think negatively about you, or you will begin to think negatively about me because we haven't spoken to each other. We haven't seen each other face to face. And so we are just hardwired to start thinking the worst about the other. Like, I remember not too long ago, I was traveling to Louisville for some school and my phone had died for like 2 hours on the road and I was like recharging it. And by the time I turned my phone back on, I just see like all of these texts and missed calls from my wife. And I call her back. I'm like, yo, what's up? And she said, oh my goodness, like I thought something happened to you. I was so worried. I was scared to death. I hadn't heard from you. I even like called your parents to see if like they had heard from you. And I was like, yo, it's only been 2 hours, like chill. I was fine. But the truth is, where there is a void in communication, negativity will fill the void. So get into the shoes of God's people for just a moment. It had been 400 years. What were they thinking in that time? Maybe they were thinking, man, God's given up on us. Maybe we finally crossed the line and we're irredeemable. Maybe they were thinking, man, God isn't real. I've heard stories about how God showed up and spoke, but man, that's happened so long ago that I just don't believe that stuff anymore. Or maybe God doesn't care about us, or he's forgotten about us and he's not going to show up. You would imagine there'd be a lot of impatience and uncertainty and doubt and anger and grief. And in the meantime, they waited. And similarly, when it comes to us, perhaps you've had your own void of communication when it comes to God. Maybe you're struggling in one way or another and you're left with this feeling in your soul wondering, God, where are you? God, where are you in all of this? Perhaps life feels monotonous to you and you feel apathy and boredom creeping in. Like every day just feels the same and you wake up and you get the kids ready for school and then you go to work and you come home and you put the kids down, you go to bed and then you just repeat and on it goes day in and day out. And perhaps mentally you're just on cruise control and in the process you've lost your sense of zeal. You've lost your sense of meaning and purpose and mission, and you're left wondering, God, where are you in all of this? Perhaps life feels painful right now, and your life is not turning out how you thought it'd turn out, whether you're experiencing a loss in your life or this season of life that you are in right now, perhaps might not be what you signed up for. And in the midst of the pain and the heartbreak, you are asking yourself, God, where are you? God, where are you in all of this? Maybe for you, life feels really lonely and you're on your own, maybe because of an unmet desire to be in a relationship, or maybe you're trapped in a loveless marriage. And during the holiday season, when everything seems so cheery and bright and happy, you look at your own life and man, that loneliness is just exacerbated all the more. And you're left wondering, God, where are you? Where are you in all this? And the good news is, in the midst of our questions and in the midst of our confusion, God comes in to break the silence. And that's what the Advent season is all about. As one author put it, he says, the celebration of Advent is possible only to those who are troubled in soul, who know themselves to be poor and imperfect, and who look forward to something greater to come. In other words, if you feel troubled in your soul, Advent is for you. And if you feel poor in spirit, Advent is for you. And if you feel imperfect and lost and alone, perhaps you feel stuck in your shame and guilt, Advent is good news for you. The disciple John puts it like this in John 1:14 that Ant read for us earlier. He says, and the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. And we have seen his glory, glory as of the only Son from the Father, full of grace and truth. And there's a whole lot going on in that verse, but I just want to pick up a few phrases and words and unpack that for us a little bit. First is that idea, the Word became flesh. So if you're an Israelite and it's been 400 years since you've heard from God and you hear it described as the Word, you're thinking about a couple of things. You're thinking about how in the Old Testament, the way God brought creation into existence was through speaking a word. That before that, there was disorder, there was darkness, there was chaos. And then God shows up and he speaks a word, and it becomes order and light and life and harmony and love. When you hear the word, you would think about how God would raise up prophets to speak on behalf of the people. God would give someone a word to then say over his people. And if you're living in this time of waiting for 400 years, you would have seen it as God who is finally breaking the silence, and he's doing it by coming down, by being made flesh. The disciple John goes on and he says that we have seen his glory. That word glory literally means heaviness or weightiness, and it's revolved around this idea of God's supreme power and holiness and perfection and beauty. And in the Old Testament, God's glory was something people could not handle. At the very least, it was something only the high priest could do once a year, but he had to go through so many rituals and sacrifices for him to have access to peek in on God's glory. But for the most part, his glory was not something people could just see. It was something they could not handle. It was like getting too close to the sun. Your body was not made to handle all that fullness and all of that glory. And the irony and the beauty of God becoming flesh is he makes his glory something we can finally experience. In a strange way, he does it by being born in a manger, in a cold, dark, smelly barn in a small town, in a barn filled with animals to parents who weren't even married yet. God, the glorious, he breaks the silence by being born in a non-glorious sort of way. Philippians 2 riffs on this same idea. Speaking of Jesus, he says that Jesus emptied himself by taking the form of a servant, being born in the likeness of men. So the long-awaited Messiah, the King of Kings, the greater Moses, the promised one, becomes a baby. And in all of his glory, he takes the form of a lowly servant. The extraordinary becomes ordinary. This is just part of what we're talking about when we prepare ourselves in the Advent season. And then the last phrase I want to point out from John 1:14 is this phrase, dwelt among us, that he dwelt among us. Dwelt is a really odd word choice in the Gospel of John. He could have used any other word that would have worked. He could have said, and we've seen his glory, and he lived among us. He could have said that. That would have made a lot of sense. He could have also said, and he abided with us. That would have worked in John's gospel, but he chose the word dwelt among us. It's this Greek word skeneo, and it literally means he made a tent with us, or he made a tabernacle with us, which is a really weird word choice. So what's going on there? So back then in the Old Testament, during the Exodus story, the primary way God would speak to his people was through setting up a tabernacle. That as God's people would wander through the desert, whenever they would stop, they would have this transportable tent that they would set up, that the Levitical priests, they would go through the rituals and the sacrifices, but this tent was not just a symbol of God's presence among his people, but it was this literal sense where God's presence lived because God longs to be with his people. He longs to live beside them. And this theme of God's presence and living with his people is kind of all throughout the scriptures. You think about how in the book of Genesis, creation in the garden, creating the first humans, God creates a home for his people, for them to live with him and he with them to enjoy him forever and ever. But because of sin, they are exiled from the garden. They're exiled from their home. And as the Israelites wander through the desert, God creates a tabernacle, a tent for them to be with him and experience his blessing. It's like going back to the garden again, his presence with his people. And then sometime later, David comes to usher in Israel's kingdom. Solomon, his son, creates a temple for God to be with his people and experience him. But once again, because of Solomon's sin and the sin of future kings, that temple is destroyed and God's people are sent into exile again because of their sin. And then sometime later, as God's people, they're stuck in Babylon. But then they're told they can go back to their land again and they rebuild the temple, but it's nothing like it used to be. The temple is back and it's rebuilt, but God's presence is no longer there anymore. He no longer speaks to his people. And so when John says that Jesus made a tent or made a tabernacle among us to dwell with us, what he's saying is God's literal presence has come down, but it's not in a tent or a temple, but it's through a person. Or another way of thinking about it, it's like God has come down and he is moving into the neighborhood. He's come to live with his people and he's not going anywhere anymore. Because where sin came in and exiled us from his presence, Jesus is going to make a way where not even sin can get in the way of us experiencing him in all his fullness, in all his glory. Because Jesus, the greater Moses, is also the greater tabernacle. And Jesus is the greater temple priest who doesn't have to perform sacrifices every day and every year, because Jesus is also the greater sacrifice who will do away with sin once and for all. And this is Advent, and this is why we have reason to celebrate. Amen? And this means wherever you are right now, whatever you are going through, for those who follow King Jesus, we can know down within our bones that God is with us. That's what Emmanuel means, that he is with us. His presence is here and he is with you and he is not going anywhere. And when you know that, when you know his presence is with you, there is hope no matter what you're going through. And I would say there is hope even in the heartache. There is hope even in the pain. There is hope even when all feels lost and confused, that there is hope because God is with you. And there is power in his presence with whatever you are going through. There is power in his presence. I remember one of the most painful, hardest times in my life came about 3.5 years ago. I remember we were trying for baby number 3, and my wife got pregnant, and the thing ended in a miscarriage. And I just remember just feeling so hurt and confused. And I just remember the power of people's presence in those moments. Like I'm with my wife like that night of, and we get a knock on the door, and it's a woman from our life group, Erica, who just showed up with a basket of these sweet little goodies for my wife and just said, "Hey, I'm here for you, and I'm so sorry," and gave her a hug. I remember the next day, I show up at the office and I tell one of our pastors, Alan, about it. And he just gives me a big hug and says, "I'm so sorry. And you just go home. You just be with your wife for right now." And I just remember all of the hugs, all of the tears I shared with people, all of the phone calls. There was power in their presence to know I'm not alone in my pain, but I'm sharing this pain with them, even in all of this. And here's the good news of the Advent season. How much more is the power in the presence of the God of the universe who came to be flesh, to be with you, no matter what you are going through right now. And I don't know what you're going through, but in all the heartbreak, when all seems lost, when all feels dark and hopeless, Jesus has made a way to be with you, to be your Emmanuel, to be God with us in the hurt, in the heartache. So in your apathy, in your boredom, let the power and the presence of Jesus speak to you this Advent season, that Jesus is with you, that he is present in your life, that he knows all things and controls all things and is inviting you even now to experience deeper meaning and purpose found in him. In your pain, let the power and presence of Jesus break through the silence in your life. Because of Advent, Jesus makes a way to be with you even when all seems lost and even when all seems hopeless. He's come to dwell with you and he's not going anywhere. And in your loneliness, let the power and the presence of God made flesh speak to you this Advent season. That King Jesus makes himself lowly to be with you. Jesus, who's God, makes himself a servant to meet you where you are. And King Jesus, born in a manger, one day, later in his life, will one day climb up on a cross and experience the greatest loneliness of all when he dies for our sin. May Advent then be our hope that God came to us, that he is Emmanuel, that God is with us. He was born, he dies, but he didn't stay down. And even though he arrived here, born in an inglorious way, one day his second arrival will be unlike the first, and he will come to rule and reign once and for all, and to bring us home in all his fullness, in all his glory, forever and ever and ever. Amen? And until that time, we are a people who wait. We're a people who wait. So until our time, we sing this. We sing, O come, Emmanuel, and ransom captive Israel that mourns in lonely exile here until the Son of God appears. Rejoice, rejoice, Emmanuel shall come to thee, O Israel. God delivered on his promise to show up, to be with his people. God will deliver on his promise when he says he will come back for us to rescue us once and for all. Will you pray with me, please?